your time and talents. Visit commemorativeairforce.org to find out how you can support the organization and also find out about all the different aircraft that are flying. The air shows schedules are starting to come together, and you'll be able to see where a lot of the CAF airplanes will be flying at different events this year. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and welcome again to everyone watching on YouTube, on Facebook, and on those watching on GoToMeeting. If you'd like to do so, if you could do us a favor, just take a second and hit the like, share, or subscribe, and follow us button, depending on what platform you're on. It'll help you keep up to date with the latest videos and presentations we have from CAF, and also lets us know that you enjoy what you're seeing. Well, at least we hope you're going to enjoy what you're going to see here tonight, because we're going to talk post-war B-17s with Scott Thompson. And before we dive into our topic, as we're talking tonight, Scott has a wealth of knowledge on B-17s, and if you have any questions that pop to mind when we're talking about something, and you think, hey, what about? Type that in the comment section on the social media platform that you're watching the broadcast, and Leah Block, who is in Houston, will relay those comments to me, and we'll try to work them into the conversation. If nothing else, we'll save time at the end to make sure we can clean up any questions that may come in for the audience. But we like to involve the audience as much as possible and keep this a very interactive episode of CIF Warbird Tube. And with that long introduction, I'd like to welcome our guest for tonight from California, Scott Thompson. And Scott has been a B-17 historian and aficionado for many, many years. And Scott, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that is the post-war B-17. So, you know, the airplane, the B-17, of course, is well known for what it did during World War II. And not to, you know, that there's an awful lot of information about how it fought in the 8th Air Force and in the various theaters around the world. And when I was a kid, I started kind of looking at where B-17s were and the remaining ones, and then I started amassing files, and I really became interested in the post-war airplane and what it did after World War II. And that eventually just dated into the book Final Cut, which was first published in 1990. And that was really an initial look at the post-war B-17, both civil and military. So what I wanted to do tonight, though, was just kind of expand on that. And I wanted to run through about 40 photos here of just kind of cover, just kind of scratch the surface of what the B-17 did in the years after 1945, because in the 40 years or the 30 years after World War II ended, the B-17 was used for a whole lot of different things that the original designers never ever envisioned it being used for. And you know, those little special roles it had are of interest, because a lot of stuff that we deal with today came out of some of the stuff the B-17s did after World War II. So I'm going to move through these slides fairly quickly and just kind of cover briefly some of the different uses of the airplane. And then I hope there'll be time at the end for discussion and questions and any other information that we can talk about. So getting started, this first slide is for anybody. I assume most of the guys here are probably pretty knowledgeable about the B-17 and some of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight. But in case you're not, I want to make sure to, you know, provide some information. This photo actually was taken at Dallas Love Field back in 1961. There were a number of B-17s parked on that airfield that went derelict, that became the source of, these were all ex-Navy airplanes, and they became the source of a lot of the B-17s that survived into the 60s and 70s. So this is kind of an interesting photo that shows them trying to rehabilitate an airplane to ferry it out. So anyway, we're going to jump right into this, and let's talk about. So there were 12,731 B-17s built between 1935 and 1945. About 4,000 roughly were lost in combat. About 4,000 roughly were lost in training accidents and other non-combat losses. And of the remaining 4,000 that survived, most of them were being scrapped at the end of the war. Most people are familiar with the large scrap yards at Kingman and Walnut Ridge and numerous other places around the country. But at Kingman, this photograph was taken in 1946 at Kingman. There were 1,800 B-17s there. Almost all of them, virtually all of them, ended up being scrapped, except for probably 3. So that was the fate of most of the airplanes after the war. And one of the reasons they were scrapped, a lot of people don't think about, why they were scrapped. There were 2 big reasons that not only B-17s but other warplanes were scrapped. One was they really had no further purpose. They were obsolete as far as the U.S. was concerned. But one of the reasons was they didn't want some of these airplanes to fall into the wrong hands and get into some of the other conflicts around the world. So there was a plan to scrap most of the airplanes just to keep the control of all these warbirds from spreading all over the world. Well, with the B-17, of course, there was one significant use of the B-17 by the military, the Israeli military, in their first war of independence in 1948. 3 B-17s were exported and used by the infant Israeli military to fight wars in 1948 and 1956. And this was really the only combat use of the B-17 after World War II, where it's actually employed as a bomber. At least it's the only one that I'm aware of. There were several other air forces that did use the B-17 and probably would have used it as a bomber if circumstances required it. But as far as I know, the Israeli Air Force was the only one that actually used the airplane in combat after World War II. The U.S. Air Force, or in this case, the Army Air Forces, they had many brand new B-17s in storage, and they found lots of good uses for them. One of the first uses after World War II was they converted a fleet of B-17s into remotely controlled drones that were used to, in some of the, well, specifically the first test in July of '46, Operation Crossroads in the Pacific, which was a nuclear test. One of the atomic bombs was actually 2 atomic bombs were detonated, and they used this fleet of B-17s to remotely fly near the resulting explosions and take measurements. So there was a whole squadron of B-17s that were used as drones, and another corresponding group of B-17s that were used as drone controllers. And the drone controllers would be stationed many miles from where the nuclear explosions were occurring, and then they would fly these airplanes remotely. This was actually very early technology, but it was fairly successful. They could actually remotely fly these airplanes off the ground, fly them around, and then land them without anybody on the airplane. This is just a view of one of the ground controllers. They would take them off with a ground controller next to the runway and then hand the control of the drone over to a nearby B-17 to actually take it from there. And the Air Force used drones all the way through the 1950s, with the last B-17 drone being shot down in, I believe, 1960. So there was a long program, 15 years where the Air Force used drones as to test targets, to be used as targets for missiles and other anti-aircraft weapons. And the drones, in most missions, the drones were not actually, there was no intention on actually shooting them down because they wanted to reuse them, and they were designed, the tests were designed to detonate near the airplane, but not to shoot it down. But as you can see in this picture, there were the damage that was inflicted on some of these B-17s mirrored what happened over Germany in World War II, where significant damage, but these airplanes were still able to be flown back to base to be repaired and to be used another day. They were also used as nuclear test targets, along with other airplanes, but there was a number of tests that were done in Nevada with B-17s used as targets. They wanted to test the configuration of tailwheel airplanes versus nosewheel equipped airplanes, and broad wings and small wings, and how airplanes were damaged by nuclear explosions. So they had a really good number of B-17s that were used for that purpose. A lot of test programs in the Air Force use the B-17 for a variety of different programs. In this case, this one had a wingtip cockpit that were trying to test different, I believe, whether or not airplanes could be flown from the wingtip. It turned out it didn't really work too well because the people got airsick really quickly flying in that position. But it was a test program, and they used the B-17 for it. A lot of VIP use of the B-17. It's not a luxury airplane, but they equip the airplane with seats and beds and galley, and they would assign it to generals. This particular airplane survives. This one is flying as the movie Memphis Belle, currently based down in Palm Springs. But this is a view of that airplane back during the Korean War when it was assigned as a VIP B-17 to a general. The CIA also had several B-17s that were used to primarily to drop agents into areas. I know that in some cases there was overflights into China, Indochina, Tibet, and the long range of the airplane was quite suitable, and so there were several B-17s that were used. Some of them were farmed out to the nationals government on Taiwan, and they would also do the same mission with the airplane. Another test program, several B-17s were modified to carry test engines in the nose. In this case, this is a Wright turboprop engine, and it's powering the airplane. All the other four engines are feathered on this in this picture. The cockpit on these airplanes, on two of the B-17s modified to carry the fifth engine, were actually moved aft 3 feet to allow the installation of the engine in the nose, and also to provide better weight and balance. The Navy had a fleet of B-17s. They had in excess of initially 20 B-17s they modified to carry early warning radar. And this was a program that started in World War II. Primarily, the intent of this was to fight or to use radar to detect kamikaze attacks. And the program was not developed completely before the war ended, but a lot of the airborne early warning technology was developed using Navy B-17s, which were designated as PB-1Ws. In this case, you can see obviously the big radome on the bottom in the Bombay position. It had P-38 style drop tanks installed between the outboard and inboard engines to extend the range. The airplanes initially were fully armed, as you can see here. Later, the turrets were removed, but they could be reinstalled if needed. And these airplanes were active for 10 years with the Navy from 1945, and they were generally withdrawn by 1955. This is actually a photo of the airplane that now flies as Texas Raiders, and that was taken in the late 1940s, shows that configuration of PB-1W. The Coast Guard also had a fleet of B-17s. They were designated as PB-1Gs, and they were equipped initially with the Higgins hard boats under the airplane that they would use to drop to air crews that were in the water. And later on, the hard boats went away, and they converted to rubber light boats that they could drop out of the bomb bay. But the Coast Guard used these airplanes until about 1960, and they were used primarily for sea rescue. They had a radar installation in the nose, but they also used them for iceberg mapping and also for photo mapping. So they had a wide and long use for the Coast Guard. This view shows a Coast Guard PB-1G that had been used with U.S. Geodetic Survey to basically photo map many parts of the U.S. We're done with this installation in a PB-1G to create very accurate maps and charts. Survey was a good thing the B-17 was used for. It was a good high altitude airplane, had turbochargers on it. It could climb up to 30,000 feet, and very stable airplane. And this was a Fairchild airplane here. And actually, when they were flying photo lines with the airplane, the pilot flew the airplane from the bombardier position with the autopilot controls that originally were installed for the bombardier to use. He could fly the airplane very accurately from the nose of the airplane and fly very accurate photo lines when they're doing photo mapping. The French also got in the photo survey business. The IGN in France used 13 B-17s for photo mapping all over the world, not only photo mapping, but other type of survey work. And they used these airplanes all the way into the 1980s. Very significant use of the airplane. This is the CAF Texas Raiders airplane again, this time as a photo mapper used by Aero Services Corporation. And it was used from the late 1940s to the mid 1960s as a photo survey airplane. Not only photo survey, I shouldn't say it's not photos, but also other types of survey work with the airplane. Some of the initial civil, or they're not really civil uses, but the B-17 was a war memorial. A lot of the B-17s that survived into the post-war period were war memorials. This is a well-known B-17 that was used as a advertising gimmick at a gas station in the Portland area after World War II. This airplane survives today. It was disassembled and removed from the gas station probably 10 years ago, and it's under restoration. But this was a private venture, but there were a lot of cities and different organizations that got B-17s after the war, and they would put them on display. Boy Scouts, American Legion posts, and a lot of communities have B-17s that were used for war memorials for probably the first 5 years after the war. And then most of them got tired of having war memorials, and they disposed of the airplanes. There was another less known outfit in Oklahoma that got some actual combat veteran B-17s and used them for the same purpose. They were gas station covers. This was actually an 8th Air Force veteran, Yankee Doodle dandy. And it came out of Stillwater, Oklahoma, which was a scrapyard. They trucked the airplane down to Oklahoma City and it was installed over a gas station. There were several airplanes that were set up by the same gas station company. It didn't work very well. Eventually, the rumor is these airplanes were eventually broken up and buried as landfill somewhere in Oklahoma City. So, but it has a shovel and a lot of time. Go try to dig up a B-17 somewhere in Oklahoma. The actual first civil use of the B-17 was done by TWA, the airline. They took a brand new surplus B-17, had Boeing go through it, clean it up, take all the armament off it, and convert it into a passenger transport. And they used this airplane to develop new international airline routes, particularly in the Middle East. They used it just for a few years, but it was the first B-17 converted for civil use, and it was actually the first airplane, the first type airplane to receive a limited type certificate. So this airplane was eventually sold to the French. They used it as a survey airplane for a number of years, and then it was eventually scrapped. The airplanes that the military converted to 5-engine test beds carried forth into the civil world. This is the same airplane we saw before, but by this time it was owned by Wright Aeronautical Company, and they were testing engines that were eventually installed on the Constellation. I guess this would be a 3350 R3350 engine, turbo compound engine being tested on a B-17. One of the more widely known use of the B-17 was for films, particularly right after the war. There were several films that featured the airplane. This is a view from 12 O'Clock High that was shot in 1948 of a belly landing flown by Paul Mantz in Florida that showed up in the film. These airplanes used in the filming of 12 O'Clock High of the movie in 1948 were actually survivors, or they were the drones that were used in Operation Crossroads 2 years earlier. So some of these airplanes, they had to monitor how much radiation was still on the airplanes when they flew the airplanes to make sure that nobody was getting excessive dosage of radiation. This B-17 was the one used in the TV series 12 O'Clock High in the mid-60s. The Piccadilly Lily, based at Chino in California, and it was an Air Force drone controller. It was one of the last drone controller B-17s, the DB-17G, that was flown, and they retired these in 1959, and the Air Museum at Ontario was able to get a hold of this B-17 and on loan, actually, from the Air Force, and they used it for the TV series. Still used in movies. This is a scene from the movie Memphis Belle in 1989. They used several B-17s for that film. And even today, there's a production underway right now that depicts the 8th Air Force in action. It's a Spielberg production. They're not actually using any B-17s, any real B-17s for that film, but it's a production that still focuses on that airplane. Another use, cargo transport for the B-17 after the war. This was the Bolivians used them as meat haulers. They had a fleet of B-17s. They were not always in the best of condition, but they would actually haul meat from the valleys in Bolivia. They would butcher cattle right next to the airplane, throw the carcasses on these B-17s and fly them to higher elevation cities where they were dressed and sold. So there was a number of these airplanes were used, and there's still a few of them around. They've been converted to something else now, but they were considered meat haulers, and they were dependable, very utilitarian airplanes. The turbochargers, once again, when they were working, would greatly assist in providing the performance needed to fly the cargoes around in Bolivia. Another purpose, B-17 was used for both crop dusting and also later air tankers, but in the southeastern U.S. in the early 60s, they used B-17s for suppression of fire ants. They would actually drop pellets of a pesticide all over the southeast, and all in an effort to eliminate the fire ant. It was ultimately unsuccessful, but it was a widely used program in the early 1960s. They used several B-17s to come in, and they would fly very precise patterns back and forth across the thousands and tens of thousands of acres of the southeast dropping these Myrix pellets in an attempt to control the fire ants. This particular outfit was Dothan Aviation, based in Dothan, Alabama. They had 3 B-17s. They also had several PV-1s. As can be seen here, this was a company photo shot. The 3 B-17 in the background, all 3 of them, well, 2 of the 3 survive. One is EA airplane, and the other is an airplane based in Oregon. The old pub is one of these 3 B-17s. Of course, the big post-war and well-known use of the B-17 was as an air tanker, and there was approximately 23 B-17s used as air tankers in the years between 1960 and about 1980 or so. They were the initial large air attack airplane used to fight forest fires. It and the PB-4Y Privateer were the heavyweight air tankers for the first decade of air tanker use. And it was a very versatile airplane. Even though it kind of lumbered around a lot, it was able to fly in and out of the canyons and the mountainsides, and it was used very successfully. However, they did lose 8 of the B-17s in the tanker operation, so it was a dangerous job and remains a dangerous job. This view of this air tanker operated by Aero Union is actually the airplane that now flies a Sentimental Journey with the CAF in Arizona. One of the oddball air tankers was this particular B-17F that was converted with the use of Dart turboprop engines from a Viscount airliner. It was short-lived, unfortunately. It only lasted a few months after the conversion. It was lost in a collision with terrain while fighting a forest fire. Another view of an air tanker, another Aero Union airplane. Actually, I take it back. This is Butler Aviation airplane seen in Porterville, one of the air tanker bases in California, back in the late 1970s. You can see that, it has a fiberglass nose cone instead of the glass nose, and these airplanes were stripped out to lighten them up as much as they could to carry as much air fire retardant as possible. And another, this was an air tanker that was converted to be used in the film Tora, Tora, Tora. Aircraft Specialties at Mesa, Arizona had 5 B-17s they used as air tankers. And in between firefighting season one year in 1968, they were all lent to the movie makers for use in the film. Several of these airplanes flew the following fire season marked with the Air Corps colors, but they were re-equipped with their firefighting equipment. And this airplane, I'm not sure which airplane this is. Two of these airplanes used in the filming of Tora, Tora, Tora were lost in air tanker accidents after the filming was completed. But that kind of gives a width and breadth of what the B-17s were used for between 1945 and 1965. A lot of use, unusual use. There were other ones we didn't really talk about, carried vegetables in the Caribbean. They were used for radio test programs. So a lot of varied use. It was a good, solid, dependable airplane, and it was, a lot of parts were available for it. So it was widely used and widely respected. And we're fortunate today that these airplanes were used so widely, because that allowed these the surviving airplanes to come down through the decades to where we are now. There's approximately 48 B-17s, intact B-17s around still. So that's where we are now. We have a fleet of Warbirds, many of them flying, also B-17s available in museums to see. and that's primarily because of the use of these airplanes after World War II. So I'll mention that I have a website, aerovintage.com, that has a lot of B-17 information available. One of the things I feature on there is a location and status of surviving B-17s. This is the first page of that. Just shows you where the airplanes are, and actually I was wrong. It's 47 B-17s surviving, and this shows where they are and has a little picture of each one of them. The website also has different things about things like production of the B-17, where they were built, different things. You want to say something, Steve?
Well, I was just going to say there's a wealth of knowledge on the website. Aside from the B-17s, you've got information about the B-25s and their role post-war, and also Talmad's Aviation, which is obviously the movie company, and your own journey on building your own aircraft. So there's plenty there. But how did you get so interested in the B-17 to begin with?
12 O'Clock High, the TV show.
Okay.
Probably like a lot of kids who grew up in the 60s. I grew up in Orange County, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump from Chino or from Ontario, and I knew they filmed the TV series over there. I watched it whenever I could. My dad wouldn't always let me stay up till 10 o'clock on Friday night to watch it, but when I could watch it, I did watch it. And I was able to persuade him to take our family over to try to find the B-17 in 1966. That was the first B-17 I saw was at Chino. And ever since then, I just had an interest, and I've slowly collected files on the surviving airplanes and the other airplanes that were used after the war. So I am particularly proud of the Tallman section on the website for both Paul Mance, Frank Tallman, and Tallman's Aviation. So if anybody has the interest in that direction, there's a whole large sub-website on aerovintage.com that talks about Tallman's Aviation. And they did operate a B-17 also for several films. And so there's a bit of a history about that particular B-17 on that website. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that all this material comes out of Final Cut. 5th edition, it's gone through many expansions and refinements through the years, and I would encourage anybody who has a serious interest in the post-war B-17 and the surviving airplanes to get a copy of this book. Right now, for the month of March, I am offering this book. If you buy Final Cut, I'm going to toss in my B-25 Mitchell and Civil Service book. If you go to my website, you can see that. There's a coupon, and there's information about both books on that website. So if you have interest in either the B-17 or the B-25, there's a chance to get both books for the price of one, if that interests anybody.
Good.
So I wanted to leave time for questions and discussion. Hope there is some.
Oh yeah, we've got some questions coming in. For those of you watching on Facebook or YouTube or go to meeting, if you've got a just question, go ahead and type it in the comment section, and we'll compile those and forward them on to Scott. Tell me how your methodology has probably changed over the years as far as researching these aircraft. I mean, the World Wide Web wasn't much of anything in 1990 when you wrote the first or published the first edition of the airplane or of the book. Things are a little different today.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of letter writing. And I still have a book that's probably 3 or 4 inches thick of letters that I kept from doing that, because I got a lot of, back in 1990, there was a lot of people still around who flew these airplanes or were flying these airplanes. And so I have a lot of good historical information I pulled that way. I did a lot of microfilm reading and a lot of microfiche reading. A lot of people probably don't even know what microfiche is anymore, but that's how they used to, the FAA used to give FAA all the aircraft registration files on microfiche. And now I don't think you can even find a microfiche reader, but that's where I pulled most of the information. One thing I tried to do was to nail down the actual dates and the owners of these airplanes through the years, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about who operated, who owned the airplanes. And the legal owner is not always the guy who's flying the airplane, but it definitely helps fill in some of the details by knowing exactly who owned a particular airplane at a particular time. So, but yeah, I visited a lot of places, took pictures. I contacted a lot of aviation photographers to get photos from their collections, Air Force, Navy, and a lot of good guys who really cooperated with me in getting pictures together for the first editions of the book. So,
in your opinion, what was the most unusual post-war use of the B-17?
it was probably the 5-engine test beds, even though the Air Force developed them. As far as the modifications of the airplane, that was certainly one of the more unusual uses of the airplane. There's like one-offs, like the Tropical Fish Company in Florida modified a B-17 to carry fish, and they would go down to Colombia or down to South America and get tropical fish and carry them back to the U.S. There's just a lot of weird stories like that. Really weren't a lot of drug runners that used B-17, so that was fortunate. The airplane is kind of a slow airplane for that kind of stuff, so it didn't really get much traffic that way. But there was just a lot of really weird little uses of the airplane. They call it the pickle bomber that carried cucumbers from Bermuda to Florida and back, and they carried ice cream the other way. So just a lot of very strange little stories.
With the 5-engine test bed, we saw some of the photos that you had in your presentation. They were all propeller-driven engines. Was there any jet engine testing that went with that?
Yeah. The Navy tested a jet engine on a B-17 that hung from the Bombay. And I can't tell you, I'd have to look it up what engine it was, but it was in the late 40s, and it was kind of an obscure airplane, but it had a jet engine that was attached to the Bombay, and they did aerial testing with it. The 5-engine test beds, the two main ones, there was actually 3 of them. Curtiss Wright had one, and Pratt & Whitney had one, and Allison had one. And they all tested either large reciprocating engines or turboprop engines in those airplanes.
As we look back today, in all the years that have passed since World War II, I think it's sometimes difficult for people to understand the mindset in the country after the war. And we look at it now as why are there only 47 B-17s that are still intact, and there's only a handful that are even flying, or some of the other aircraft of World War II. We look back now with nostalgia, but it was a much different time in 1946 when everything was coming back from overseas.
Yeah, and I think you see a lot of comments about how short-sighted the government was by scrapping all the airplanes, and actually, my opinion, they were not short-sighted. They had a very deliberate program to get rid of the airplanes because, first of all, they had no use for them. They were obsolete. What were we going to do with thousands? They're literally like about 50,000 surplus airplanes after the war. What do you do with them? Nobody wanted them. They tried to sell some just to make some money, but the other thing was the Air Force knew that if they had 1,000 B-17s parked in the desert, they were going to have trouble getting new jet-powered B-17 or B-47s or B-52s, because the Congress would say, well, you got a fleet of airplanes out there, why don't you use those? So there was pressure by the military to get rid of the airplanes, and There was also the concern about them falling into the wrong hands. So it was definitely a deliberate. Now they full well knew exactly what they were going to do. Now there were efforts to save some. I mean, they had a Army Air Forces museum, a lot of airplanes set aside that ended up being scrapped, well, not accidentally, but they needed the room for something else. But you know, the memories were short, and some of the airplanes probably should have been saved, but they weren't.
Let's see here. What do we got? Oh, one of our viewers is wondering, what did they put in the nose of the meat locker airplane? Did they pack the entire airplane full of meat?
I think so. Yeah, wherever they could throw meat, they threw meat. And the most of the airplanes had a big cargo hatch on the side, but they also would use the nose. Weight balance really wasn't a concern. It was what they could fit in. They would. And you hear stories about these airplanes flying in, and they would just drip blood out of the bottom of them because the raw meat was just thrown in there. I had the unusual pleasure of going into one of the meat haulers when it came back from Bolivia in the early, I think late 70s, early 80s. It was the airplane that's on display now at March Field Museum in Riverside, California. And it smelled, and there was still caked blood on the floor of the airplane. It was kind of gross. It's been cleaned up since then, but I mean, it was very obvious the airplane was used very well. I would say they got their money's worth out of the airplane, put it that way. So,
And speaking of money, what if you were to purchase a surplus B-17 after the war? What was the price range of an aircraft?
the government was selling them for 13,500 or so thereabouts. That was the initial price, and of course, if you translate that to 2021 dollars, you're looking at several $100,000. So it wasn't a bargain. It sounded like a bargain, but it really wasn't a bargain. But after a while, like in the 1950s, when the Air Force was getting rid of the last airplanes, they were selling in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. So during the initial surplus sales, educational institutions were getting the airplane for $300, and it would be delivered. But they didn't actually get title to the airplane. They just got permission to display it. And the $300 was probably just a fee to process paperwork and to make sure that they were serious about getting the airplane. But like the Memphis Belle, $300. You see references that it was sold for $300 in Memphis. Well, it wasn't really sold. It was put on display, but the Air Force or the U.S. government retained title to the airplane, which was the difference. You pay $13,000, you got title. You pay $300, you got permission to display it.
Yeah, that's one of those eternal questions that always raises an argument from both sides whether the city of Memphis actually owned the B-17 or not. There are those who defend it to either side. So,
well, it's it is a good question because that came up a lot of times when there were several enterprising individuals who went out and found all these war memorial B-17s, and then they would buy them, quote, buy them from the city that supposedly owned them. And then when they tried to register them, the CAA came back and said, "You guys don't own the airplane. You can't register it until you own it." And then they have to go back to the government and negotiate a price to get title to the airplane. The real enterprising ones got the airplanes and exported them to South America before anybody got wind of anything. So
there's always some interesting stories that go with Warbird aircraft, especially in the late 50s and the early part of the 60s, as to title and ownership lines sort of get blurred from time to time.
Yes, and there's still, I mean, you come across stuff in some of the research where you realize that a particular operator doesn't really own the airplane, but you don't say anything. I mean, it's like, whatever. It's, in other words, this all happened a long time ago, and people have forgotten, and the paperwork is long gone.
Right.
So anyway,
Is there a role you think the B-17 would be well suited for, but it never really fulfilled, either during the war or post-war?
no, I think it was pretty much everybody kind of like found uses for the airplane that it was good at. Um, you know, it wasn't really good for passenger transport. They tried that a little bit here and there in the few years after the war when they were desperate for passenger transports, but it doesn't lend itself to that big bomb bay in the middle of the fuselage. It's cramped. I mean, anybody who's been in a B-17 knows there's not a lot of room. And it is slow and it costs a lot of money to fly. So, you know, you have to have deep pockets and you have to have a specific mission. That's why aerial survey was such an ideal mission for it, because it was stable and it could fly high. And air tankers, the same thing. It was built strong enough to be able to take the loads it required to carry a load of retardant and drop it on a fire. So
Right.
nothing specific comes to mind anyway.
All right. You touched on the aerial survey and aerial mapping. Of course, we take it for granted today with Google Earth and Street Views and things like that. But following World War II, there were vast sections of the world that hadn't really been mapped, and that's really where the B-17 was able to contribute to society and to our general knowledge base.
Right after the war, Europe was photo mapped by a squadron Air Force group, bomb group, one of the bomb groups left over in the occupation force. They photo mapped Europe and North Africa. And then after, the U.S. government in conjunction with other foreign governments did a lot of mapping in the Middle East. And in the U.S., most of the initial charts that were developed in the 50s were all developed from photos that were taken from the B-17 that the Coast Guard operated. So, and the CIA got involved too with a lot of I come across some promotional material for Fairchild aerial surveys about when they photo mapped Afghanistan, talking about what a forward-looking country that was, and they were talking about, all the stuff they were doing and helping them develop, and a lot of that was done. I mean, it started with photo surveys to see what was there, and those maps also conveniently went to the CIA for their use.
You've talked about several of the different companies that operated B-17s, and I think when you look at the history of the aircraft, we owe kind of a debt of thanks to groups like Aero Union and Dothan Aviation and Aero Services. Were there some other larger operators that deserve a little recognition as well for keeping the B-17 alive?
Yeah, Aircraft Specialties, another tanker outfit.
Yeah.
Black Hills Aviation. So there were several tanker outfits that flew the B-17s, and they kept them. They kept them around. Fairchild Aerial Surveys and Aero Services were the big survey companies that flew the airplane. There were some companies like the Chicago Tribune had a B-17 they used for its owner to fly around the world. And the French IGN had 13 of the airplanes. So those companies are the ones that kept the majority of the airplanes around for us to have today. By the way, I'll mention that the back of Final Cut, I list all of the civil owners of all of the airplanes so that you can kind of go through and you might see some guy owned 4 or 5 B-17s in the course of him operating the airplanes. And so sometimes it's a bit surprising to see how many airplanes were owned by an individual. Maybe not all at the same time, but he owned them.
One of our viewers is wondering if you could talk about the Fulton Skyhook and rescue operations for downed airmen.
Sure, that's an interesting story I didn't really touch on, but the CIA, Fulton developed the Skyhook idea, and there's a lot of history behind it, but essentially what happened was they developed the Skyhook, and it was a device that they would mount on the front of the B-17 that would be able to come in and extract an individual from a combat situation. He would have a balloon that would inflate, and then he would be flown into the air, and the B-17 would come by and grab him, and then they would pull him into the airplane. There's a good example of that seen at the end of Thunderball, the James Bond movie, where they actually demonstrate how that was supposed to work. And supposedly, the Skyhook program was actually employed on a B-17 to extract a Russian or two from a polar ice station. So they also planned on extracting a B-26 pilot shot down in Indonesia in the late 50s. They had planned on extracting them with the Skyhook, but the diplomats worked out a release for them before they ever did. But, it was definitely one of those, kind of weird little programs that worked out pretty well. And later on, variations of that were used. They mounted the same equipment on C-119s and probably C-130s to snag satellites. They would eject photo canisters out of a satellite, and then the airplanes would come by and snag the parachute carrying the canister to recover the negatives for intelligence purposes. So a strange program, but it worked. But yeah, anybody who sees Thunderball will see the was the Evergreen B-17. Back then it was Intermountain Aviation, which was a CIA company, demonstrate the Fulton Skyhook program.
That must have been one crazy ride.
Well, apparently Sean Connery wasn't actually doing that. It was a dummy, but yeah, they did several live tests with people who volunteered, but and apparently, like I say, he's got these Russians off the ice cap that way too. So I don't think those were willing passengers. They were just snagged off the ice cap. But anyway, yeah, unusual program.
You mentioned the 12,731 B-17s, 31 manufactured. They were not all manufactured by Boeing. They were manufactured by several other companies under license. Who were some of the others?
Douglas at Long Beach built B-17s, and Lockheed, actually, when they started, it was Vega at Burbank built them, and by the time 1945, it was Lockheed actually taking over Vega. But yeah, they built B-17Fs and B-17Gs at those two locations, and quite a few airplanes. Most of the surviving airplanes are either Lockheed or Douglas airplanes. Both Texas Raiders and Sentimental Journey are Douglas built airplanes.
And I know many years ago, I worked with EIA's B-17 doing some of the early restoration work on the radio compartment and some of the interior components when they were putting it back into more realistic livery than what it had been. And so, yes, we used the microfiche reader to look up the blueprints of the airplane, but also finding out that the airplane was built by Vega and it had Studebaker engines on it. So that was kind of an eye-opening experience, and talks to the mood in the country where everyone was pitching together. It didn't matter if you were a competitor outside the war. During the war effort, it was all for one.
A lot of subcontractors involved in building these airplanes, engines, turrets, guns. In some cases, not so much with the B-17, but a lot of, like the A-26, the wings were built by Beechcraft, and there were a lot of people came together, and it's amazing how much we did so quickly to create the production capacity we had. We were cranking out at one point, I believe, between Boeing, which one day delivered 16 B-17s, I believe, and Douglas and Vega, we might turn out 30 or more B-17s in a given day in 1944, early 45. So that's a lot of airplanes. And I think you look at the production capacity, if you take the total number of airplanes built during World War II by the U.S. and divided into the number of days. I think it's about 300 airplanes a day was the average of production capacity for the country. It's pretty amazing.
How many of the surviving B-17s have you either seen up close or had an opportunity to take a flight in?
I think I've seen all the ones in the U.S. The ones overseas, I've not seen, but you know, there's several in South America and several in Europe. But yeah, so I've had a chance to fly in one. I still haven't had a chance to fly one though. I'm waiting for that opportunity. So
There you
I came
go.
a couple times, but I haven't flown one yet.
Well,
So,
and should just mention your piloting expertise. You've flown large round engine tailwheel aircraft in the past. You were with the FAA's DC-3 program that was at air shows for quite a few years.
yeah, that was quite a kick. I enjoyed flying. I mean, just starting a radial engine is so much different than anything else. So it was great. I really enjoyed it. I did, for the FAA, I flew Learjets and King Airs for do flight inspection. And it's amazing the difference between flying a modern Learjet, what you can accept to fly it, versus flying an old airplane like the DC-3. It's night and day. You know, you got a screw loose on a Learjet, it's grounded. If you don't have a screw loose on a DC-3, something's wrong with it. You know, like they say, how do you tell if the DC-3 has oil in the engines? Because it's dripping. So it's the same thing.
There you go.
If you have no oil into the engine, there's no oil in the engine.
Hey, we'd like to say a good evening to some of our folks. We have quite a far-flung audience tonight. People checked in from Sydney, Australia, Oslo, Norway,
Wow.
Portland, Oregon, Red Hill, Pennsylvania, and several others around the country. So welcome to all of you, and hope you've enjoyed talking about B-17s in the post-war era. Just a couple of minutes left. Scott, we've cleaned up almost all the questions. Wait, there was one more. Oh, the truly million-dollar question: what would it cost to build a real flyable B-17 these days?
That's a great question because there are people doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not sure the number of dollars it would take. It just takes a tremendous amount of skill. And, you know, I don't know how many people are familiar with Ray Moore down in North Carolina, but he is building a B-17. They're actually building several of them. And he's a one-man operation for the most part, as far as actual hands-on the project. Now, I don't know how much it's costing him, but I know that if you're going to pay somebody to do the kind of work he's going to do, you're talking about extremely skilled craftsmen. And to do it quickly, you're talking, I would say, well into 8 figures. You know, you're talking $10 million or more to really do it quickly. Ray Moore has said basically he'll never see the completion of the project because it's going to take so long, but he's hoping his grandkids can see this airplane fly. So anyway, I mean, more power to people like that because they have the vision and the skill to do it.
Yeah, it's very true, and I think our viewer is probably wondering why no one's building a brand new B-17. But when you look at the restorations that are underway, they're almost brand new airplanes. They're just not rolling off an assembly line like they did in the 40s, but they are building and creating brand new parts to make these airplanes.
When you look at what's happening in Urbana, Ohio, with the Champagne Lady, and they had to rebuild the wing. You know, the fuselage is complicated enough, but the wing structure is obviously very important. And the kind of detail work that's required to basically disassemble the wing and reassemble it it has, unless you really know what they're doing, you really can't appreciate it. But if you look at what they're doing, it's like, holy mackerel, it's like, you know, it's hard to understand how people have the vision to do that for 15 years to get a wing put back together. So it's amazing. I just did a post on my website about that effort at Urbana with that wing. So if anybody's interested to read more about that, it's on that website.
I was just going to put a plug in for that because I read that article just, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago. You posted that, something like that. But it was actually a story I did not know until I saw that. So definitely, if you get a chance, scoot on over to Scott's website. The address is right there on the screen, and check out all the information he has. Subscribe to his newsletter. He's got updates on a lot of the B-17 projects that are taking place around the country and around the world. And you keep up to date if you're a fan of the B-17. This is the place to be. So, Scott, just with the couple of moments we have left, any final thoughts before we close out tonight?
Well, I think it's, well, I appreciate the opportunity. And I know I went through a lot of material very quickly, and I hope I didn't overwhelm anybody. But, you know, the B-17 is one of those airplanes that just has a mystique about it that it's hard to explain. But even people who don't know anything about airplanes or don't care about airplanes, when a B-17 flies over, everybody's turning to look at it. Or when a B-17 is taxiing by it, to me, I mean, it's kind of it's just a cool airplane. And once you learn about the history of the airplane, you realize, you know, what it means, what the airplane meant to so many people during the war. And we're fortunate that we have those airplanes out there now, and we can see them and we can watch them and we can ride in them. And it's a rare treat that won't last forever.
Well, there you go. That's good advice. Go find your closest B-17, or if you're taking a vacation, see if you've got a museum or even a flying B-17 somewhere in your itinerary. Go see it, support it, the museum or whatever organization is operating the B-17, as we keep these wonderful pieces of history alive as long as we possibly can. Scott, thank you again for joining us. And folks, AeroVintage.com is the website. Don't forget that book offer that Scott talked about earlier. And thank you again for joining us. Now, if you have a suggestion for a future topic or someone that you'd like us to talk to on Warbird Tube, just drop Leo Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to Scott Thompson for sharing just a little sliver of his knowledge this evening. Go visit the website; he's got much more. You'll get lost in the B-17 history, and trust me, you'll enjoy it. Until next time, I'm your host, Steve Buss. Have a good night.